Thanks very much. And I know what some of you may be thinking, which is there even a word? Evaluability. And just to explain, you'll be delighted to know I'm not going to evaluate SDS, and we are not going to evaluate SDS. What we're doing is trying to ensure that SDS at the end can be evaluated. And I'm going to do that in 4 ways. We've been asked to do a number of things. I'm just going to take you through each of the 3 things you're going to be asked, what we've been asked to do. I'm going to tell you the story so far, where we've got to. We started in November last year, and we're now about halfway through, so we're reporting in August this year. Some of the issues that have cropped up so far, many of which I suspect will be only too familiar to you, and our next steps, where we go from here. So these 3 things were, first of all, the evaluability assessment. In other words, can we describe the difference that SDS is making to service users and to the systems that support them and the people who support them? Secondly, a bit of a dive into the economics. There was some early evidence that said if you really offer choice and control to individuals about the service they receive and how they receive it, that does lead to not only an improvement in the quality of their life and their well-being, but actually you save money in terms of longer-term costs. So to what extent can we tell that story? And here we'll be complementing the work that Kirsten Rummer will be talking about to you about next. And finally, option 2, and I'll come back to that in a minute because there's some quite odd stuff about option 2. And why are we doing all this, or why is the Scottish Government asking us to do it? Well, they've spent £70 million on this transformation, and they clearly need to be able to tell a story about the difference that's made. But critically, this is a chance just to make sure that the description we can make of how people's lives have been changed by gaining choice and control is a very important description to make and to be able to tell us. So this is about all of us and how we can tell our story. And we hope that what comes out of both our work and the ultimate story that comes out of this will actually help us all make the service better. And so this is a little snapshot about what's working well and what's working less well. So just to dive into each of these, the evaluability assessment. And we had to do a couple of things here. One was to refine the original logic model, which is saying this is what we're trying to achieve with SDS, and here are the things that need to change to achieve that. And you may recall in the forward plan, there were 4 outcomes, supported people, about workers, about commissioning, and about systems. So we were asked to revisit that with actually several of you in this room and say, do we want to refine that? Do we want to tighten it up? Do we want to make it more specific? And then below that, identifying the changes that need to be happen to make those outcomes occur. In other words, what needs to change and how do we describe each of those changes in a very specific way which we could measure and describe. The second thing was about the economics and to what extent SDS is cost effective. And really this is again not saying is it or isn't it, but it's saying what story can we tell at the moment, what are the gaps in that story, and can we dive into some particular case studies to see how it's possible to fill some of those gaps and make sure we can tell a complete story at the end of the day. And the third one is about option 2. And those of you who've looked at the published stats will be able to see that option 2 looks a bit odd. And the fact it looks odd is important because it was the one novel feature of the Act. There were quite a few people who had personal budgets. Option 3 is kind of the experience of many service users over a long period of time. But the ability of service users to identify their needs and gain choice and control over that, and then have that delivered for them, alongside them, was new. And yet, what the stats show is take-up is very low, that it's very uneven across different geographical areas, and there's no obvious logical sense in what the figures appear to be telling us. So it was important to dive into that and say, are these figures real or apparent? What's going on here? By diving in and listening to some stories, can we really understand what this is telling us and whether we need to do anything about it? So what have we done? In terms of the evaluability assessment, we have looked at the overall framework, the initial framework, and explored that with workshops for frontline staff and with strategic level staff, some of who are in this room, so thank you very much for your contribution to that. And refined the top level, in other words, the aim, the key outcomes, and then dived below that and said, and how do we describe the changes that need to happen in order to deliver that overall aim? And this is what it looks like. Some of you may think you should go to Specsavers, but it's probably not as bad as that. But let me just take you quite carefully through this, because there's some important refinements here. If you look at the top aim, it says people's social care and support outcomes are met. It doesn't say, as the original document did, supported people's. And this is a clear reference to the fact that SDS is supposed to be about adopting an approach and a style and a way of working and an expectation that affects everybody who is involved in the service. And secondly, if you look at the blue ones, what's clear is that right at the heart of the success of SDS is the service user experience. And therefore, we've separated out choice and control over the social care and support and the extent to which they're empowered through very high quality information to make an informed choice about that. So in other words, this reflects the significance of putting the service user right at the heart of this. So the two below that are things that help that happen. One is about the people who work around them and support individuals, and the other is about senior decision makers and the systems. Are they all organised in a way that help all that thing to happen, help choice and control become real? And then underneath these are the things that need to change, and I hope these make sense to you. If they don't, come and have a word with me afterwards. But I just want to look at the bottom line, actually. If you go along the bottom line, people should be informed of the budget available to them and be able to direct it creatively and flexibly. Creatively and flexibly. Now that's, the explicit use of those words reflects what it is we want to see happening. And if we're not able to capture the fact that that's happening, then we probably need to do something about it. If you look at this, the next one, frontline workers are encouraged and enabled to exercise professional autonomy. In other words, we probably are only going to get this to work when you've got empowered service users working alongside empowered supporters and workers. So have we got that combination of empowerment really going on, that real autonomy of frontline staff? And then the next one along, 17, procurement and commissioning processes help choices to be made with flexibility, personalisation and creativity. In other words, the whole way in which services are procured, does it really encourage and support the flexibility and creativity we want to see? So I hope you feel that this represents the world you live in, and that with your help we've identified the changes that need to happen and need to be described in order to have a successful outcome to this process. So far, the other thing we've done as part of this is to look at what other people have been doing elsewhere in terms of evaluating similar kinds of approaches around the world. And just to highlight some differences, some conclusions from this. One is, and it won't surprise you, the question about what is a good conversation or a quality conversation. And there's no evidence from any of the evaluations we've looked at that help us say, what does a good conversation or a quality conversation look like and feel like? What's the client's experience, the service user's experience of that? There's nothing that really helps us move ourselves forward on that. And actually, most of the studies we've come across around the world dive into specific groups or supported people or stakeholders or issues. Only one from Australia looks at an evaluation of the whole system. And then a lot of these try to capture these high-level outcomes about patient well-being and satisfaction. And what's interesting is that when they seek to do blanket surveys, they get very low responses. And the ones that really work are those that try and understand the different situations and characteristics of service users and ensure we're capturing stories from each one of those. So I think there's a real lesson for the evaluation framework from that. So the other conclusions we drew from that review were this importance of understanding that challenges vary by need, for example, dementia, and by characteristics, for example, sexuality. And unless you're capturing that as you're going along, it's very hard to understand what's going on. So we really need to have that kind of fine-grained insight. There's also a need to monitor individual progress over time. There's much more need to say, this is what the journey looked like for the individual, for families, and carers, for the providers involved, and for the community as a whole. And unless we can tell that story over a period of time, we're actually missing some tricks in understanding the difference that the approach made. And then how this choice and control leads to changes over time in terms of the long-term outcomes. And again, we need that longitudinal assessment of stories to try and assess that. And finally, whether more control now, choice and control now by a service user, actually leads to a transformation in service provision flexibility over the long term. So what's the feedback between client user experience and the way in which service is delivered and the range of services available? The economics one, a very short story because we haven't actually started that. But we're now starting to draw on existing research, and we'll be diving into some case studies because we're pretty sure the existing research will say we can tell this story but actually go no further. And it's actually really important, particularly at a continued time of austerity, to be able to tell the story that actually by doing this well, you actually not only transform individuals' lives and well-being, but also it appears to reduce the pressure on other budgets down the line. Option 2. So we've looked at the data, and like you have said, this doesn't seem to make sense. There's lots of things here we don't understand. So what we will be doing is diving into some case studies and looking at people who have chosen option 2, or what might be called option 2, looked at what definitions are being used locally, because they clearly vary quite a lot, looking at rural and urban areas and seeing what difference that makes, and understanding the choice of option 2 and the way it's panned out in the context of the broader approach in that local patch, because we need to understand the wider context to understand what's specifically happening about that particular option. And we won't be looking at this long tail of very interesting stories about garden huts and people going to Manchester United and so on. We'll actually be looking at bread and butter cases, probably dominated by older people for obvious reasons, and saying, what do these everyday cases look like in terms of option 2? And is this telling us a story that we need to respond to, or actually is what's going on the ground seeming to meet service users' needs and allow them control and choice? And so the story is lots of issues with the data. Anyone who's looked at the data says, wait a minute, what's going on here? This doesn't make sense. I didn't even recognize my own area here. In terms of the approach, in terms of the stage of evolution, in terms of how the approach has been rolled out, and in terms of definitions. And we're going to examine what lies behind that in terms of case studies. So what kind of issues have we come up with from this sort of initial dip in the water? One is obviously lots of issues about data, and that's not so much about how data is collected, but what it means when you look at it, and how people are interpreting it differently, how people are collecting it differently, how people are using different definitions, how different areas using different approaches. And there's obviously specific issues about definitions, particularly around option 2. There are issues about eligibility. Where is the eligibility bar set? And is that rising over time? How are people responding to financial constraints? And how are people responding to the availability of services? We do know, for example, in some remote rural areas, there is much higher take-up of option 1 because the services aren't available, and therefore there's actually more scope for individuals to make that service happen for them. And then what choices actually mean in practice. And we've had something you'll be more than familiar with, which is the choice really about the time people have and the quality of that time? Is it just about the time of a carer, or is it about something more than that? Is there some real creativity there? Is there a real assessment of need and character, and a listening to the client and an understanding of how to respond to that appropriately and how to help them make options and choices? And as part of that, how are those options and choices presented? I mean, at one extreme, option 3 is great for you, isn't it? I exaggerate for effect, but you'll all be familiar with the notion that how these options are presented, how that good quality conversation takes place at the assessment and review stage can influence how a service user responds to it. And then what are these options anyway? We had a very interesting response at one of our workshops. Obviously, there's a lot of nagging about options, and people are saying, wait a minute, why this focus on options? Everyone should have choice and control. Surely the option is not about that choice. The option is actually about how their choice is subsequently made to happen. There's obviously a lot of issues about consistency between areas, about staff guidance, information, the approach, the extent to which they feel empowered and are empowered. Do they have the kind of delegated authority they have rather than having to go to local assessment panels, which builds in delay and so on. And then last but not least, is the language we are using helping? And a lot of insight we were getting about user responses to words, service users' responses to words like outcomes. What on earth is an outcome? I'm struggling with it still. So that's the story about where we've got to, and the next steps are a dive into understanding what the gaps exist around measuring all those light blue boxes, the changes that need to happen, a very specific dive into the economics and resource implications, case studies to look at the information about option 2, what's really going on there, what do we need to do, if anything, about option 2, and that all draws to a conclusion in August 2018. So that's our story. Thank you very much.